Well, I thought we'd look at just a couple of the things that when Brad and I were out in the Northwest, I'll show you a couple of things here that we were researching. Here is Chief Cliff. This was interesting. Now, we went on our field trip by here, but the interesting thing to me was we had a busload, 2 busloads, 125 people total on this field trip. And there was, I think, 4 or 5 professional geologists, and who were on the trip. And I think 4 of them. There was 2 of them on each bus who were considered to be tour leaders, and then there were several other geologists who had actually been tour leaders for past tours that they had led, and not one of them really understood the significance of this cliff right here. And I'm going to show you about Chief Cliff at a future date. Okay, well, I'll fix that. But basically what you got here is, look at the texture of that.
Where did it come from?
This is stuff out of Canada. Right now, there's sort of a controversy brewing about the cause of the Great Missoula Flood. And, the conventional view has been the ice dam. And the ice dam is in western Montana, and it breaks and all the water flows west. Well, these Canadians, these heretical Canadians, have been proposing for about 5 or 6 or 7 years now that some of the water came out of Canada. And that's what I actually believed at least a decade, or no, more than that, 15 years ago. And when Brad and I went to Canada in 1999, we were looking for evidence that the flood had actually originated up in the Canadian Rockies. So now some of the Canadian geologists are saying that, and what you can see is if you start talking to some of these guys on the American side, you can see that there's like 2 teams forming. There's the Canadian view, which is sort of the heresy, and then there's the American view, which is the idea that it all came from Lake Missoula through the ice dam. And one of the major pieces of evidence that the Canadians have cited is that there were big flows coming down these, like the Columbia River comes out of British Columbia. It comes out of the Canadian Rockies and flows south into Washington. Now, I don't know if you can see this. I would love to do a larger image of this. I could probably actually copy and drop this into my PowerPoint program. We could look at it better. But I mean, if you look at this, you'll see that this is, you can see the sweeping currents in here and the surging. What you had here is multiple surges. Very complex. You probably also had back currents as well.
Hey, Randall, how far upstream is that from Lake Roosevelt?
This actually is at the upper, right, this is at the upper end of Lake Roosevelt. Right at the end, yeah. Actually, my thinking about the Sanpoil River sediments has evolved, but I don't want to get into that now. But those were actually those weren't the catastrophic floods that did those. Those were the floods. See, there was 2 types of floods, Bill. One flood, and this is why the geologists haven't been able, they've got it mixed up. Because there were 2 flood regimes. The catastrophic floods that were caused by something that exceeded several orders of magnitude over the normal melting, right? And then there was the normal melting. But now the normal melting, even though, was catastrophic compared to what we're familiar with today, because when ice sheets and glaciers recede, they can cause large-scale flooding. Of course, nothing on the scale of the Missoula floods. The Missoula floods were thousands of times bigger than the biggest known modern floods. Thousands of times bigger. Okay, but what you had there was you had, I'm theorizing, 2 episodes of catastrophic melting. One occurred at 12,900 years ago, and one occurred at 11,600. Those 2 episodes are probably, I would say almost certainly, the consequence of something cosmic that we've talked about repeatedly in here. But going up to that first episode of 12,900, the Earth was going through its natural climate oscillation of warming and cooling that it does. So as the climate was warming for 2 millennium before the 12,900 event, the climate was warming. What has happened is that warming that was already going on has confused the issue incredibly, which has prohibited them from differentiating the fact that there were two melting episodes, two distinct forms of melting. Okay, at 12,009, something produced hundreds, actually thousands of cubic miles of meltwater instantly. Okay, the normal melting was something that was happening on an annual basis, you know, the glaciers receded. In the wake of that 12,900 catastrophic melting, the Earth, which had been warming for 2,000 years, went back into the full depth of glacial cold, similar to where it had been 18,000 years ago. And that's what we've talked about in here is the younger Dryas. So between 12,009 and roughly 11,006, the Earth was in this deep freeze, okay? Several hundred years before the 11.6 event, the Earth started warming out of the younger Dryas, because the younger Dryas now was a consequence of that catastrophe. And the catastrophe undoubtedly did something that reproduced the conditions that are present when the Earth goes into a glacial episode, which probably means a dusting of the atmosphere with cosmic dust. That's almost certainly what that means. The second episode at 11,600 is the one that finally took down the mega-mammals. The 12,900 event decimated the mega-mammals, but it didn't cause their extinction. And in the interval, they rebounded somewhat. Their absolute population numbers rebounded. The second event at 11,600, which I think of as the Atlantean event, because that was the date that Plato gave for the sinking of Atlantis, that was the second melting event, the second catastrophic sea level rise event, the final extinction of the great mega-mammals. And at that point, whatever happened, the second catastrophic event completed the process whereby the Earth came out of the Ice Age. The first one caused this vast melting and this rapid rise of sea level, but then everything refroze. Sea level dropped again. The glaciers expanded after this catastrophic melting. The second catastrophic melting, you know, was almost like it kick-started the interglacial. So there was a difference between the two events. Now, what does that mean? Probably this. My guess is that the second event probably involves more impacts into the ocean and into the ice sheet itself. The first event probably involved more land impacts. And why would that be? The reason is that the land impacts are going to put more dust in the atmosphere and cause forest fires. And one of the characteristics associated with the 12,900 year event is the so-called black mat. And at all of the Clovis sites around North America, you know, the Clovis, in the archaeological sense, the Clovis were the first people to occupy North America. They were followed by the Folsom people. The Clovis people were 12,900 years and older. The Folsom people were 11,600 years and younger. You get that? So there's an archaeological parallel. Archaeological, yes. So the Clovis people, with their cultural characteristics, disappeared at 12,900. The Clovis people were contemporaneous with the mega-mammals. And when you see the hunting sites of the Clovis people, they're hunting extinct mammals. The Folsom people are hunting extant mammals. They're hunting the mammals that are alive today. So we have this cultural hiatus. Older is the Clovis, which back in 100 years ago, when the Europeans were studying it, they identified the same hiatus in the archaeological record, and that's what separated the Paleolithic, or Old Stone Age, from the Neolithic, or New Stone Age. So we are, in America, it's the transition from Clovis to Folsom. So the Clovis, you can see the Clovis artifacts are associated with extinct animals. The Folsom are associated with animals that exist. So now you have this hiatus between these two events. The first event, which caused a catastrophic melting, but then resulted in the Earth going back into a deep freeze. The second event caused a catastrophic melting, but it continued and the entire glaciers disappeared. Instead of returning and growing back like they did after the first one, they disappeared. So those are some of the facts of the case, and the speculation is what was unique about the two events? Why did the first one not end the Ice Age? The second one did end the Ice Age. And the only thing I can come up with that makes sense is that the first one was more land impacts, and the second one was more ocean impacts and impacts into the ice sheet itself. So therefore, there wouldn't have been as much dust raised, but there would have been lots and lots of rain, and that rain would have contributed to the further melting and destabilization of the remnant ice. Does that make sense? So figuring out, though, what happened back then, I think, is one of the crucial things that science needs to address itself to. And this right here is evidence that I'm thinking probably relates to the second event. And the second event was, again, essentially the date that Plato gives for the sinking of Atlantis. Now, Plato, there's a lot of things that Plato doesn't say about Atlantis. I think he leaves out a lot more than he puts in. But what he does say is interesting, and he almost hints, because, you know, he talks about Atlantis going through this sort of it goes through a moral demise at its end. I mean, it's very much biblical in the sense that just like the Noahite flood was preceded by, this, or the Hopi Indians, again, the same thing as this moral degeneration sets in, and then they always, you might interpret it as being a consequence of the flood, but, you could also look at it as being, well, the moral degeneracy was essentially their tuning out. In other words, their focus became so here and now and so focused upon the immediate gratification that they failed to pay attention to a larger reality. And that larger reality is ultimately the reality that governs our life here on Earth. And so by not paying attention to that reality, we are now vulnerable to the things that it throws at us. And so when you read Plato, though, he sort of implies that he says that Plato, that Atlantis underwent this degeneration, and that they became totally interested in just, basically power, worldly power, instead of spiritual power. They became, if you've read, I'm sure everybody has read Critias and Timaeus as many times as I've recommended reading it, but if you have read it, you'll know that one of the things they describe in there is that Atlantis finally, as the final mark of its spiritual degeneracy, is it starts trying to enslave people. Okay, so, but, if you think about it and you strip it of its moral implications, there may have been just something in the fact that, Atlantis was, as I've shown you, how many of you have seen the program I did on Atlantis about a year ago? Okay, how many of you remember it? Okay, good. Well, Plato gives the sinking of Atlantis at 11,600. Now, 11,600, as it turns out, happens to be the same date that scientists are giving for this second catastrophic sea level rise. To me, that can't be a coincidence. That's got to be a connection. And in the Atlantis program, I showed you what I think was the scientific explanation was that you could have had a large island complex in the mid-Atlantic. In fact, the evidence strongly supports the existence of an island complex in the Atlantic centered on what is now the Azores Islands. And there's evidence that, the mountains, the undersea mountains whose tips are the Azores Islands are part of a microcontinent that has all of the evidence that would lead to the conclusion that it recently sunk. And they were documenting that back in the 1950s and 1960s even, taking dredge samples and so forth off the flanks of these undersea mountains whose peaks are the Azores Islands, and dating things on there that, suggested that it had actually been land, and or shallow, like finding 2 miles down, finding abundant remains of shallow marine creatures that don't live over depths of 100 to 200 feet. I mean, there's all kinds of evidence consistent with the conclusion that that island complex actually sank. And you could say, theoretically, if you look at the physics of it, which the physics of the Earth is called rheology. If you look at the rheology of it, it makes sense because you had this massive transfer of weight to the Atlantic Ocean. And that sudden rise of sea level caused a corresponding sinking of the ocean floor along the mid-Atlantic ridge, which is a hinge zone. The mid-Atlantic ridge is a hinge zone. And the Azores are part of a microcontinent that flanks that hinge zone. That same hinge zone runs up and it runs through Iceland. In fact, if you want to have an analog for what Atlantis probably was, look at Iceland. Of course, climatically it's totally different because the Azores would have been far south of there. And also there's evidence showing that the Gulf Stream went right north and then turned south about 1,000 miles further south than it now does. And it seemed to be hugging the shores of this Azores microcontinent that was above water. Well, with the Gulf Stream flowing like that, it would have made a very benign climate. During the Ice Age, those islands would have been probably one of the most pleasant places on Earth to live. And if there was going to be a culture that could achieve levels of advancement and sophistication and so forth, that wouldn't be an unlikely place for it to happen. If you take Plato's details, everything that he says in there, and cross-reference it with modern scientific discoveries, it all makes sense. But you've got to remember that the academic geologists back in the 60s and 70s started saying there's no evidence, geological evidence, for Atlantis being in the mid-Atlantic. So if you read the literature of Atlantis, going back to Ignatius Donnelly in the 1880s, up through people like Lewis Spence and even who was the psychic guy, Casey. If you read the stuff going up to the 70s, what you see is they're all pretty much looking at mid-Atlantic because that's consistent with Plato's description. It's consistent with what Diodorus said. It's consistent with what Proclus said, the mid-Atlantic. So now in the 60s and 70s, with the advent of plate tectonics, you have the geologists saying, no, there's no evidence that there could have been any kind of a sunken landmass in the mid-Atlantic. So what you see is the literature of Atlantis suddenly begins to shift, and now you have this whole proliferation of things where people are going, okay, well, here's Atlantis, it's in the Mediterranean. It really is in the Mediterranean. That was what Plato meant. Now, he was off. He made a mistake by a factor of 10, and it wasn't actually 11,000 years before his time. It was 1,100 years before his time. And then they tie that with the eruption of Santorini, the volcano that erupted around that time in the Mediterranean. You have another author saying, no, it was actually in Anatolia, Turkey, because there's a city there, and there was a big earthquake, and the city got drowned under a lake. Somebody else is making the argument that it was in Cuba. Somebody else was making the argument that it was in the southern Great Britain. Somebody else was making the argument that it was the Bahamas. Somebody else made the argument that it was actually in South America. I got a book on that where the guy makes this, makes a whole argument saying here's why it was in South America. Then of course there was the one that came out about 10 years ago where they said it was in Antarctica. Well, you see, all of this proliferation of all of these other places came because the geologists said there's no hard geological evidence that it could have happened, that there could have been a large landmass in the mid-Atlantic. And I'm only thinking, apparently these guys haven't even looked. They haven't even looked. They've just assumed.
No, they don't know what to look for.
Because it's there. And I've shown it to you. I've shown you a part of the evidence, and the evidence is overwhelming. That there is a sunken landmass in the mid-Atlantic Ocean, and that it sank geologically recently, and that it could have, there's absolutely no reason why it couldn't have been occupied during the Ice Age.
Randall,
Charles.
this material here was deposited at about the same time as the Atlantis,
Yes.
or where was the ocean in relation to this material?
Well, this material is probably 3,000 feet above the ocean.
Okay.
But this material was deposited by water that was leaving the glaciers
Right.
and headed for the Pacific Ocean.
And was carrying all this debris.
Carrying all of this.
And it stopped for some reason.
Well, at the end of the flood, basically when the water source terminates,
It just stopped.
it stops. Because you got to picture the water's flowing along, and as the faster it's flowing, the more material that it can carry suspended.
Right.
But then as the water begins to slow down, or if it's going through a constriction, it speeds up. If it goes into a basin, it slows down, right? If it's going over a shallow gradient, it goes slow. If it hits a steeper gradient, it goes fast. As it goes faster, it becomes more erosive. Now it comes to a shallower gradient or a basin, and the water slows down. When it slows down, it begins to deposit its cargo of sediment. So, in fact, what happened here is the river valley widens out, right, very close to where we are here. See, we're at the north end of Lake Roosevelt. So Roosevelt comes up, and essentially it fills the wide part of the valley, and then the valley constricts roughly between here and the Canadian border, about 30 miles north of here. So as the water came down and spread out, it's natural that this was a place where it would start building these sediment layers. In fact, if you melted all of the ice in the world, ocean level is going to rise about 200 feet. All of the ice. Greenland, Antarctica, all of the glaciers, it might rise 200 feet.
It makes sense that it was pushed up.
Yes. Yeah, now this is what happened in the 60s right here, or 70s. When is this? 78. Dorothy B. Vitaliano is a highly respected geologist who's written geological textbooks and so on. Now notice what happened here. Inasmuch as all references to Atlantis stem from Plato and no other source, which isn't strictly correct, in deciding whether it is fact or fiction, or to put it another way, whether it is legend or myth, we are faced with three options. We can take everything Plato says quite literally, we can take his words seriously but not literally, or we can take Atlantis as purely and simply his invention. Now, she concludes that it's purely and simply his invention. And even most scholars of Plato, if you read like Plato's works and you read the introduction to Plato's works written by the scholars, of the scholars of Platonic philosophy, they will assume that it's purely and simply his invention. Now, if you look at the guys like that are writing about Santorini and Cuba and Turkey and Britain and all of those, they're in the second class. They take his words seriously but not literally. You can include me in the first category. I'm a Platonic literalist. I believe Plato meant everything he said literally. And the fact that he states that at least 3 times is one thing that leads me to conclude that. But what really confirms it for me is when I start looking at the details of what he said and then cross-referencing it with the hard science. So anyways, this is actually a very good book. What she's talking about here, the current popular concept of Atlantis, was crystallized by Ignatius Donnelly in a book entitled Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. Anybody read that? Anybody read Ignatius Donnelly? No, nobody's read it. Okay. So Donnelly outlines, go down to the last sentence. Donnelly outlined 13 propositions in support of which he then proceeded to marshal all kinds of evidence. Only 2 of these propositions are relevant to a geologically oriented discussion. Now get the psychology here. Donnelly puts forth 13 propositions, 2 of which are based upon the geological science. The rest are based upon archaeological artifacts, language, the dispersion of plant material. He has all of these other things which actually could be interpreted as consistent with a mid-Atlantic source for Atlantis, right? Well, notice what she does here. She says only 2 of those propositions are relative to a geologically oriented discussion, and that's correct. But Proposition 1, that there once existed in the Atlantic Ocean, opposite the mouth of the Mediterranean Sea, a large island which was the remnant of an Atlantic continent and known to the ancient world as Atlantis. And Proposition 2, that Atlantis perished in a terrible convulsion of nature in which the whole island sunk into the ocean with nearly all of its inhabitants. So those were the two of Donnelly's 13 propositions. Those are the two that are relevant to the geology, to the geological question. Now notice what she says. In light of what is known today about the ocean floors, we can definitely rule out the possibility of a sunken landmass of any substantial size in the Atlantic, or for that matter, in any other ocean basin. Yeah, and then go down to the second underline. Nowhere in the ocean basins is there any sign of a large mass of continental-type crust which could represent a submerged continent. Now notice what the little play here. There once existed in the Atlantic Ocean, opposite the mouth of the Mediterranean Sea, a large island. Okay, get that. A large island. And that's what Plato is actually describing. But notice how the large island has become a submerged continent. What are we talking about? A large island or a submerged continent? Well, if the idea here is that the submerged continent is like an Australian or larger size landmass, well then, yeah, I agree. There's no evidence of a landmass of continent size sunken on the ocean floor. But of course, that's not what Donnelly said, and that's not what Plato said. So now, notice here how, because what she now is doing is representing the scientific way of dealing with Atlantis. With an Atlantic site ruled out as physically impossible, all arguments based on racial, linguistic, or other cultural similarities on both sides of the ocean, which would include the rest of Donnelly's 13 propositions, must collapse. Either they are not real similarities at all, or they must be explained in other ways, including mere coincidence. Well, we're talking about 11 coincidences then of a pretty striking nature. But let's take her argument and turn it around. What if, on the other hand, those two geological propositions are credible? Then how are we supposed to interpret the other 11 propositions? So finally, at the end, and here you've got to bear in mind, she's expressing the collective view of the geological community at the time, in the 70s. From the geological point of view, I fear that Atlantis must be considered just another of the myths of Plato. Notice the reductionism, just another of the myths of Plato. And there we have it. The geological authorities have spoken. The matter is settled. Any other evidence that seems to support the notion is just coincidence. And therefore, from that point on, you see the dispersal. Everybody starts looking everywhere else for Atlantis, except where Plato very explicitly said that it was. So I hope that puts this in a context for you. And then we have this clown, L. Sprague de Camp. As most good scientific fringers know, and he's talking here, you can just hear the contempt in his voice. Our industrial civilization is not the first of its kind on this planet. Long ago, they say, there throve another technically advanced culture, enjoying many of the advances that our mechanized world now boasts. Now see, this is totally a red herring. Electric power, fast transportation, aircraft, and so on. But some cosmic catastrophe wiped out this culture, leaving Earth survivors clinging precariously to Stone Age life. Well, notice here the strategy. You say electric power, fast. Did Plato say anything about electric power? No. Did Plato say anything about fast transportation or aircraft? No. He did describe a seafaring culture that were master navigators, but he doesn't say anything about electric power or aircraft and so on. So what he's trying to do is set up a reductio ad absurdum, and then by association, the next conclusion that there was some cosmic catastrophe is equally without foundation as the assertion that they had electric power or aircraft. But from what you've seen in here, is the idea of a cosmic catastrophe wiping out one of man's cultures Is that far-fetched? Is it? I mean, is that something that only a fringer, a scientific fringer would claim? Now, don't get from this that I've already excluded the possibility that they had mastered flight or any other kinds of energy control. I consider that completely plausible. However, the idea that there would have been an advanced culture doesn't necessarily mean they were advanced in the same way that we are, with the same technological basis, and that doesn't imply that there couldn't have been a catastrophe that wiped them out. Well, I don't think you have to actually surmise that it hit Atlantis. I think it's enough to say that, I think it's fairly likely that you had impacts into the Atlantic Ocean. But with the sea level rise of 400 feet and an associated adjustment of the Earth's crust, I think it's very possible that you could have a sinking of a landmass in the mid-Atlantic of up to a mile.
Randall, what happened to the X factor?
That's coming up. Well, because, see, here the connection with the X factor is that, the question raised about the energy available to melt this much ice. Okay, well, Paul just asked about the X factor, which I said we were going to get into, and it's not going to take the whole 2 hours. It'll probably take an hour, so that's why I was digressing into Atlantis. Well, let's take a microcosm. Let's look at what happened when a natural catastrophe was visited upon New Orleans a few years ago, and look at the chaos and so forth that happened in the wake of that. Now, let's say that we are talking about a left-right punch. That this great catastrophe was actually not one single event, but a multiple or a series of events triggered by perhaps two major events, one at 12,900, one at 11,600. Now, let's assume that Atlantis was an existing, long-established culture in this particular environment, and now suddenly they're faced with a major environmental change and a sea level rise, drowning their coastlines, a catastrophic sea level rise over a very short period of time. Maybe it's possible that if we were going to theorize a scenario, the Atlanteans were faced with the possibility of their own demise. And it was at this point that they began to realize that in order to essentially hold back the rising sea, they were going to have a massive infrastructure created. And I think that might have been why they found it necessary to try to suddenly start. And if you read Plato again, he talks about how they suddenly went on this campaign of trying to enslave everybody. Well, there must have been something driving that. And this led to this massive war, in which they were defeated. And then shortly after this massive war, then comes the second catastrophe that caused the sinking of Atlantis and caused, actually, if you read Plato again, you'll discover that not only the sinking of Atlantis, but the demise of pre-Hellenic Greece as well. You're dying to say something.
What if it's the other way around? What if the moral decay?
See, that's the standard explanation. I don't know. See, the normal way to interpret it, the moralistic way to interpret it is to say the natural catastrophe is brought on by the moral degeneracy. I would turn it around, just like I think Paul was implying, and I think that's what we saw in New Orleans. And I said earlier, think about this, what I said. The moral degeneracy may be just the very thing that causes people to quit paying attention to the very things that they need to be aware of in order to prevent the catastrophe, or at least to endure the catastrophe and survive through it, see?
We are suffering from our ego.
Okay. So by the way, there's Atlantis. And for those of you, at some point we should go through this again so you can really get it, but not until you've read your Plato. But there, if you want to see it, there it is. There's the sunken landmass that I've been talking about for the last 3 years. And you'll notice here's the Mediterranean. And as Plato says, to get to Atlantis, the first thing you do is there are islands that were used as stepping stones to get to the major landmass of Atlantis. Then he describes 3 mountains, which has been interpreted by some as being the basis for Poseidon's trident. And those 3 mountains are right down here. And then here's the mid-Atlantic the crack. Essentially, that's the hinge line. And over here is part of North America. And Plato describes, you know, if you sail west from the Pillars of Heracles, right here, you'll come to a group of islands, and then beyond those islands is Atlantis, and beyond Atlantis is the other continent that's on the other side of the real ocean. He talks about the Mediterranean as being not the real ocean, but when you go outside the Pillars of Heracles, that's the real ocean. And the first thing you do is you come to a group of islands, just as he describes, there they are. You proceed beyond that, and there's Atlantis. And then you proceed beyond that, and then he describes the great continent that's on the other side of the real ocean.
Where did Plato get his information?
Plato got his information from Critias. And Critias, he got it from Critias the Younger. And Critias the Younger got it from Critias the Elder. And Critias the Elder got it from Dropidas, and Dropidas got it from Solon, who is the the Greek lawgiver and poet who did a 10-year exile in Egypt, and while in Egypt was told the story by the elderly Egyptian priests. So that is the chain of succession, from the Egyptian priests to, pardon? To Solon, not Solomon, Solon, to Solon, to Dropidas, to Critias the Elder, who was the grandfather of Critias the Younger, and it was Critias the Younger who sat at the forum at the Platonic Academy and told the story. With Socrates present, Plato, Timaeus, and one other gentleman, I believe.
Did you say that story was written on some pillars in Egypt?
That was a detail not given by Plato. That's a detail that's given, if I'm recalling, it was Proclus's commentaries on Crantor. And in Proclus's, and Crantor doesn't exist anymore, but Crantor apparently wrote a dialogue about Atlantis, because Proclus references Crantor's writings on Atlantis, but they don't exist. Or at least if they do exist, nobody knows about them. And that would be an incredible thing to find. If you ever pick up the newspaper or something and read that somebody discovered Crantor's writings, that would be a big deal.
Or would it have been in Alexandria?
Well, it would have been in Alexandria, right. Now that's a detail that Plato gives. The detail that, if memory serves me correctly, Proclus referencing Crantor discusses the two pillars. And that was, and this is significant because Plato doesn't give the detail about the two pillars. Okay? If somebody else had information that Plato doesn't have, that clearly suggests that there was an independent line of information and that it was not strictly Plato's invention. You see, that there existed. And Diodorus also makes reference to Atlantis. And he talks about an Atlantean colony actually in the Atlas Mountains, which is right here. And you've probably heard of the Berbers that are fair-skinned people. Many of them are blonde, and they live right here in the Atlas Mountains. And then there were the Guanches, who are also tall, fair-skinned people who lived on the Canary Islands. They're an extinct culture now, but when the Spaniards arrived, they found the Guanches living there. And according to Spanish chroniclers, one of the traditions of the Guanches was that they were descended from survivors of Atlantis. So see, that's another element that provides independent confirmation that there was a real authentic tradition about Atlantis out there, and that Plato had access to a lot of it but didn't tell the whole story, and that it was not something that he completely conjured up and made up as a fantasy or a myth.
Well, the closest thing is the Azores. Why wouldn't there be something there?
Well, there is.
I mean, record or something.
Well, actually, why wouldn't there be a record? Well, let's see if I get... Well, there are stories, and that's one reason, Jerry, why we need to get over to the Azores. Learn Portuguese and go to the Azores.
On the other hand,
Who's going?
How deep is, could you scuba dive and find things, you think, or is it really deeper than?
Deeper than scuba diveable. Scuba diveable, you're looking at 100 feet or so, but we're talking about a mile down. Well, for about $500,000, we could rent a Russian submersible with a pilot, and they'd take us down. Who's?
No guarantees that we get up though.
You've heard of the Turks?
Well, that's what, when James Cameron filmed the Titanic, the footage they used of the sunken Titanic, that was the real Titanic. And that's the one reason that it's worth seeing his movie, because he has real footage of the real Titanic sitting on the ocean bottom. But he hired a Russian submersible, and they took him down and he filmed. Take a look at this. This is a perspective view of a digital relief map. This is outside of what the classified maps of the ocean bottom that the Navy has, which I sure would like to get my hands on. This is probably the most accurate reconstruction of the mid-Atlantic floor. And here you can see what's called the Azores Plateau right here. And these, I don't know if you can see them, but there are mountains here. There are peaks, and those are what are now the islands.
Where's Spain?
Spain is this.
All right.
Yeah, this
Those
is probably
little things sticking up there. What did
here?
you say? I didn't see. What
Well,
are
there's peaks here that you can see, and those are the ones that are still they're above the ocean that are the Azores Islands. And then these are sunken. They call them seamounts. But this was probably one of these, like this might have been Neptune's trident. You see that thing? There's 3 peaks coming up.
That's probably exaggerated quite a bit.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's a vertical exaggeration. Absolutely. You could have easily had 3 mountain peaks that would have been sticking above the water. Yes. I thought I had it. Let's look at the whole ocean basin, and you'll see the relationship. Yeah, here we go. So this is an older version, so it's not as accurate. But, you know, here's Spain, and here's Morocco, and the Azores Plateau is right here. And that last view that we're looking at, we're looking up this way. So, you know, we might have been seeing Iceland or Greenland. That landmass over to the left would have been this peninsula here. Now, when you bring up the Bahamas and Bermuda and Cuba and stuff, I think it entirely plausible, and in fact, this is consistent with Plato. He said that Atlantis had colonies, had a lot of colonies. So it's certainly likely that they could have had colonies on the Canaries, they could have had colonies, you know, in Morocco, they could have had a colony in Cuba, and the central base of that would have been that island landmass in the mid-Atlantic. Yeah, okay, let's take a look at here. One of the cobbles gave an apparent radiocarbon age of 12,000 years, plus or minus 900. The state of lithification of the limestone suggests that it may have been lithified under subaerial conditions. What does that mean?
It means under the atmosphere.
It means in the air, not under the water, but in the air. And that the seamount may have been an island within the past 12,000 years. The cruiser and great meteor seamounts studied in 1952 have larger, flatter summits at 150 and 165 fathoms depth. These youthful geos may have originated as volcanoes, which were later capped by limestone and more recently have sunk beneath the sea. But in other words, what he's saying, and this was one of the deans of marine geology, Bruce Heason, back in the 1950s. And what he was saying is that those islands that he's talking about that appear to have sunk within the last 12,000 years are these right here. Right there, there's 3 of them. 3 major. One of them is called Great Meteor Seamount. One of them is called Cruiser Seamount, and the other one is called, coincidentally, Atlantis Seamount. So somebody, even these scientists, when they were naming these things, were making the connection. Here we go. Here's the whole ocean where you can really get the big picture. Now you can see Atlantis, or at least the Azores Plateau, which is this thing right here. And then the seamounts are these right here, these, which he's saying were islands and just sunk within the last 12,000 years. And here again you can see Spain, Morocco, Mediterranean, the islands beyond the Mediterranean. Then you get to what would have been, I'm theorizing, would have been Atlantis, and then beyond that is the whole continent beyond. And he refers to it as, and then he refers to this as the real ocean as compared with the Mediterranean. Please, you guys, read Plato. It's short. I mean, you can read the 2 of them. Timaeus, that covers Atlantis, is probably only about 6 or 7 pages out of Timaeus, the whole dialogue. Critias is probably not much longer than that. Critias is entirely devoted to Atlantis. It's my belief that part of coming up with a solution to any problem is in thoroughly understanding the problem, right? I mean, isn't that how you generally come up with the... In fact, it's pointless to start looking for solutions until you've really identified what the nature of the problem is. So, I guess the moral of the story is that the solution to the problem only becomes apparent when you understand the problem. And that's why I've spent so much time analyzing the problem. And the problem is basically this, to define it, is that we're living on a planet that's vulnerable to periodic catastrophes. And that we've learned, everything we've learned in the last 30 years has suggested not only the reality of those catastrophes, which was finally beginning to be accepted by the scientific world in 1980, but the ensuing evidence has led us to believe that the catastrophes are also quite frequent. It was, first of all, the big step was accept the reality of catastrophe. Well, then, okay, that's fine. We accept the reality of catastrophe, but this is something that only happens on the geological time scale, and it's nothing that humans on a human time scale have to worry about. Well, all of the evidence that has ensued in the last 30 years has completely confirmed what the ancient people said, and what Plato said, is that there are recurring catastrophes. There have been many catastrophes through the history of the world, and there will continue to be many catastrophes. Now, if that is true, that is something that we need to be factoring in. You know, I mean, political leaders need to be talking about that. When we make long-term projections about where our society is going to be 50 to 100 years from now, which obviously people, they do. I mean, Al Gore is talking about all the catastrophes that are going to occur if we don't curb CO2 emissions in the next 50 to 100 years, and we're supposed to reorient our entire society around preventing the increase of CO2 in our atmosphere. I mean, I will give it to Al Gore of this. Whether he's right or wrong, at least he's looking 100 years down the road and saying, yeah, we need to be cognizant of 100 years down the road. Well, the other point is that once we accept that catastrophes are real, that becomes, I believe, the major thing that we need to be thinking about if we're going to be looking at the big picture. And your average person, day to day in their routines, don't look at the big picture. All you have to do is turn on the media and see that, the 99% of the media that's just complete trivial hogwash. But there are 1 to 5% of the people who have a spiritual responsibility to help bring this world to a place that it needs to be.